Well, good day and welcome back. We're pleased that you could join us again today. I'm here together again with Mike Novak, and we're looking at some classical literature. Um, Mike, the last time we were together, we started to build the premise that we could find godly and biblical themes in even what some people might call secular literature.
Mhm.
And as we're looking at literature, we're kind of looking at it as a subset of the arts in general, but we're going to include literature in that. And among the themes, the biblical themes that we can find in so-called secular literature are themes such as atonement, redemption, fall from grace. And we see that in cinema, definitely in cinema. We see it in poetry. We see it throughout art.
Mhm.
I got a book on my shelf right behind you that talks about that through the ages. It was kind of a Francis Schaeffer's revisiting of Kenneth Clark's Civilization series, and he talked about how biblical themes were evident. And he even included architectural as it relates to art.
Mhm.
But those themes we find worming their way through literature over the years. And I think there's four reasons, as I've given this some thought, there's four reasons why we see those type of themes emerging from literature and really all of art. And I think the first reason for that, and we said this in our last time together, was because man was made in the image of God. That's Genesis chapter 2. In the image of God made he them, male and female, he created them. And so God created mankind in his own image. And because we're created in the image of God, that image is pushing to get out into the world, if you will. And so that's the first reason. The second reason is what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes. Solomon said that God has put eternity in man's heart. So there are biblical themes that God has implanted in us, in all of humanity, regardless of what they believe or not believe. God still has placed that eternity in man's heart. And I think that gives man a longing for things having to do with eternity, with the eternity of their soul.
Mhm.
And there's a third reason I think that this sort of theme, biblical theme, will emerge, and that is that God has made himself known in his creation. And that comes out in Romans 1. Um, God's invisible attributes, Paul tells the Romans, namely his eternal nature. And you can see that on a starry night, and how many songs have been written about the starry night. Um, and Vincent van Gogh and some of his starry nights that he created on canvas.
Mhm.
And so we have from creation, we're given clues as to this creator God.
Mhm.
And because of that, these themes begin to emerge. The fourth reason is simply because we live in a Western culture. We live in America, and really America and the West has been shaped by the Bible and biblical themes. As we all know, America was a Christian country in the sense that really its first inhabitants were were the Pilgrims, early inhabitants, if not the first inhabitants, but they were early inhabitants who sought a freedom of worship, and so they came over here to do that. And at the same time, a decade by 1630. 20,000 Puritans had found their way over here because of the persecution that was taking place in England. And because of that, we built a nation around Christian and biblical themes. And
Mhm.
so those things emerge in American literature, but it's also true in Europe and their literature as well. Well, today we're going to pick up on still another. We mentioned three themes up here, but we're going to mention still another theme, that is really trumpeted throughout art, poetry, literature, even visual arts, performing arts, all have this theme that emerges at one point or another. And that's the theme of depravity, the sinfulness of the human soul and the human condition. Depravity is a biblical theme. Mike says that we're not as affected by sin as we might be. We're not all an extreme of a. I think the Hitler's a popular one, but I certainly think that people like Pol Pot and Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong were right in there with the running with Hitler. But but the point is that evil nature, we're not as bad as we could be. Hitler wasn't as bad as he could have been. But the point is that everybody is affected in all of their being by sin. That is to say that our knowledge is affected by sin, our emotions are affected by sin, and our decision-making process is affected by sin. Our will, if you will, is affected by sin. As I was thinking about this, I thought of the word debilitated by sin. We're all negatively or adversely affected by sin. David McCullough, Mike, is a famed historian, as you know.
Yes.
And he's a popular author as well. This is what he said. He said, history is not the story of heroes entirely. It is often the story of cruelty and injustice and short-sightedness. There are monsters. There is evil. There is betrayal. And that's why people should read Shakespeare and Dickens as well as history. They'll find the best and the worst, the height of noble attainment and the depths of depravity. And so McCullough is acknowledging in his study of history that in fact depravity is an issue for all of humanity. And a sterling display of the depths of depravity shows up in a William Golding classic, Lord of the Flies. And Lord of the Flies is a good opening display of emergent biblical themes, particularly the theme of evil and sin and depravity, as the entire plot seems to be given to the persistent degeneration of the characters into their most base expression. And so in this book, in this classic William Golding book, we see power and corruption and murder in the Lord of the Flies, and it conjures up thoughts of Samson and Jacob and David as Old Testament biblical characters in some of their misadventures. So Mike, trying to build a bridge from last week, why don't you take it from here and walk us through the plot and the characters, maybe a little bit about Golding himself and his bio as we try to sort our way through this
Yes.
classical novel.
Yes, certainly. I'd also like to add that we picked this book, Lord of the Flies, specifically because it is challenging to the Christian reader, and to illustrate our point. It's one of my favorite novels. It's a very serious book. Golding, in all of his novels, deals quite deeply with the problem of evil in the human heart. And in the series of books that we're going to review and in this series of talks that we want to do, all the authors will deal with good and evil and the struggle that goes on within people. And but we want to start with this one because it has a pessimistic view that we think Christian readers will partly recognize, but then open the question of, well, do we have hope? And that's what we'll talk about later on.
Okay.
So Golding is an interesting character. He was an Englishman who was born in Cornwall, England in 1911. He is the son of a school teacher and a mother who was a suffragette. They were atheists, but Golding was well educated and well read person, And he went to college at Oxford. And after he got out of college, he became a teacher, schoolmaster, they called him, and he taught young boys. He taught for a number of years, and then World War II came along. He enlisted in the British Navy. In the British Navy, he was an officer. He was in World War II for 6 years. He saw combat. He was in anti-submarine and anti-aircraft operations. He saw action in the battle where the British sunk the Bismarck. And he was in a landing craft for D-Day in Normandy. He saw the incredible slaughter and butchery of war.
Yeah.
And during this time, he saw that not only was the enemy evil, you mentioned Hitler, he saw evil on both sides. He saw that, warfare brings out the worst of us and may be the ultimate expression of the evil of men's hearts. So he has this moral and spiritual trauma in World War II that never quite leaves him. He does go back to teaching school and so forth, but he said after the war, he said this, I began to see, and he said this in an interview, I began to see what people were capable of doing. Anyone who moved through those years without understanding that man produces evil as bee produces honey must have been blind or wrong in the head. So he starts writing, and in a couple of years, by 1954, he has written Lord of the Flies. Tries to get it published, and he gets rejected by 20 publishers. So all of you budding writers out there, don't be discouraged. Even a great author like Golding had his difficulty getting his masterpiece published initially. And he still kept teaching and writing, and his writings began to be successful, especially Lord of the Flies. So by 1961, he retires from teaching and becomes a full-time writer. He writes about 12 novels. He does poetry, essays, and other forms, but he writes about 12 novels, and all of them deal with these serious questions of moral meaning beyond the literal story. They're very allegorical in many cases, and the theme is something that obsessed him. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1983, and in 1988 he was knighted by the Queen. He became Sir William Golding, and then he died in 1993 at the age of 82. As far as we know, he was not a believing Christian. His biographers say that in his personal life, he could be an unsavory person. He was hard on people. He drank heavily and so forth. So this is not a person we would regard as a Christian author in his personal life. We don't, as I say, he's not known to be a believer, but he displays in all of his writings, he displays a deep understanding of biblical themes and events and characters.
Let me interrupt you
Sure,
just for just a second on that. You know, I find this fascinating because I've talked to atheists before, and when they say they want to talk about God, I find that interesting because they don't even have a category for God. And here's a guy who was brought up as an atheist. Now, as you say, we don't know what happened to him in between, but here's a guy who was brought up as an atheist, as far as we know, never moved off of that position. And yet from his writings, we see emerging biblical themes about that begin with God.
Yes, and I think part of the reason for that, you mentioned it in your opening remarks, is that there's some universal fundamental truths written on the heart of each person. We just kind of know it in our being. And Anton Chekhov said that the great writer, the true writer, is a searcher for truth. And Golding is writing what he sees as the truth about human nature. I'm gonna kind of push this point a little earlier than I had intended to, but there is
as we talked about the first week, it seems as though the artist, and when we say artists, we could talk about any of the arts, the performing arts, the written arts, the visual arts, um, the canvas, poetry, whatever, however you want to define art, that there's always some expression of some truth, and very often that truth has an ultimate truth expression. And what the artist does, what the author does, is that they're interpreting for the rest of us folks. They're giving us some perspective. They're giving us some interpretation through their arts, through their philosophy, through their theology. They're giving us an interpretation of that ultimate truth. And it sounds like Golding is doing the same thing, whether or not he was self-aware as he was doing it.
Yes, I think that is the role of the storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
We mentioned last time that Jesus was the great storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
Almost all of his teachings were like parables.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't give so much sermons as parables. And stories are a great way to teach and a great way to learn. So the Christian reader, our point is that good books should be read, because not only for the joy and pleasure of a well-written piece of art, but also the insight you get into other people and their problems and their issues, and the better understanding of human nature that we get from them. It makes us, as we say, better witnesses when we have that.
Well,
So.
see, now I'm pushing this point early too, because when you talk about that, being better witnesses, we get involved in the arts and literature so we can understand this. And this is what we've chatted about before in the past, about how Harvey Kahn was a missions professor at Westminster Seminary, and he began a series of talks that he gave in churches in Southern California, and he called it "Reaching the Auca Indians of Southern California." Now. It is counterintuitive that there would be Auca Indians in Southern California. The Auca Indians were cannibals who lived in Ecuador, and they were the Auca Indians were the people who martyred, if you will, Nate Saint, Jim Elliot, the four missionaries down there. The Auca Indians killed and maybe ate, but they were. What Kahn was trying to say was that there's a culture that surrounds any community, and the way into that culture is by way of their arts, by their literature, by their music. So Kahn was kind of encouraging people to get involved and try to understand, as we're now reading this secular book, if you will, to gain an understanding into the culture and to be able to speak into that culture with some intelligence.
Yeah, I agree with that. And let me give some overview comments before we get into the plot and characters and how they illustrate what we're talking about. There was a book written in the 19th century called The Coral Island by an author named Ballantyne. It was a very popular English book. It was one of those great ripping yarns where three English boys are shipwrecked on an island, and they set about just taking charge and making everything work. And they're very communitarian. They work together. They're very successful, and they are very triumphalistic. The book goes on, and at some point, they build shelters, they find food. When pirates come, they manage to defeat the pirates. And even at the end of the story, they convert the cannibals to Christianity and so forth. Well, Golding read that book as a young man. It was a very popular book for English boys to read. And after World War II, he came to regard that book as fundamentally false. He did not believe that was the way it would really work out. So he writes this novel about a group of in his case, about 24 boys of English schoolboys who are stranded on a deserted island. Apparently a plane crash during what is probably a setting of World War III. It's an atomic war setting. They land on this uninhabited island that has plenty of food and water and places for shelter. You know, kind of a Garden of Eden kind of setting.
Okay, now in this Garden of Eden, do you make anything out of the idea that Golding chose to have it happen on an island?
Well, yes, it's a device that he uses because Golding has an allegory up his sleeve in writing this book. He wants to have a kind of literary laboratory where he can examine some key issues and themes. So yes, I do believe that the island allows him to, an uninhabited island that has everything on it, allows him to do that.
Now, the reason why I'm asking that question is because, and maybe he knew about this, maybe didn't, I don't know, but Martin Luther was engaging in a polemic with a guy, Desiderius Erasmus, who was from Holland, a Netherlander, and he was a Catholic priest, and the two of them were having this discussion, and Luther wrote him and asked him, "What, sir, do you consider to be grace?" And Erasmus wrote back and he says, "What we consider to be grace is parents walking behind a child who's just learning how to walk, and when he falls, to catch him before he hits the ground, and that's grace." And Luther wrote back and said, "I don't think you have it right. I think grace is a caterpillar in a ring of fire." And I guess I kind of see the island idea as being the ring of fire, and here is this mortal combat that's taking place on this island, on this Garden of Eden, if you will. But here's the ring of fire, and how are these caterpillars going to get off the island, except if they're rescued from above? And so, do you make anything of that allegory of the island?
Yes, I think we're going to talk about rescue, but right now we'll give you a spoiler alert. We are going to talk about what kind of rescue it is and who the savior may or may not be.
All right.
In short order. But you mentioned, parents. Well, there are no parents on this island. There are no other inhabitants, no adults. There are no institutions. There's no government. There's no school. There's no police. There's no girls. Golding, in an interview later on, said he didn't want the complication of sexual interaction because he had an allegory he's talking about. He wants to tell a story about some key themes. So he made this a literary laboratory, and he minimized the complications. The other thing he said was, "Hey, look, I'm a male. I was a little boy. I was a father, and I taught boys in school. They're the ones I know. I think that they were suitable for the examples I wanted to use."
And so the children are formable. They're innocent. They bring nothing into the equation. So everything is kind of homegrown, if you will.
Well, we'll put some quotes on that word innocent, because Golding knew that little boys were not angels.
Okay.
And he's going to show, but that's the reason he made them young. He did not want the so-called contaminating influence of adult institutions and relationships to confuse the point he wanted to make. He wanted to see what's going to happen because of who they are.
Mm-hmm.
So he's got several levels in this book that he's working on. And that's an overview of the setting. And before I get into the plot and theme, I just wanted to mention that there have been a couple of movies made of this book. One of them was made 9 years after the book was written, and it's a 1963 version. It was an English version with English actors, and it was very true to the book. It's a very good movie. It reflects the characters and a lot of the themes very well. The setting, it's as I said, it's black and white. It's on YouTube. You can watch it for free, and I recommend it. But I will say this: no movie is a substitute for reading the book. No movie can capture the spiritual and moral and psychological insights that the author can do in the writing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't mean to be Miss Grundy, but read the book rather than see the movie only. There's one other movie I would mention and recommend that people avoid. It's a 1990 Hollywood version that really is a terrible movie. It misses the entire point of the book. It has bad acting. It does not deal well with the theme material. It throws in a lot of foul language that's not in the book. It glorifies some of the sadistic scenes, and it's just a warped version and a real vandalization of the book. So
maybe leave it up to Hollywood to ratchet up the depravity.
Just another Hollywood disappointment. Unfortunately, I would say don't waste an hour and a half of your time with it. So the English version of 1963, if you're interested. And let's start, before we get into the plot, with a theme statement, because one critic put it this way. He said that Golding was not an Orthodox Christian, but he wrote about universal themes: moral responsibility, good and evil in man, original sin, civilization and barbarism, and conscience. All themes that are deeply rooted in Western Christian civilization. Golding attempted to explore in his novels the situations and conditions under which evil arises and how it influences other people and their actions. So that is the theme setting. And let's talk a little bit about the book. It's very hard to summarize a whole book shortly, but I'll do my best. We're going to talk about these plane wrecked boys on an island that's almost a Garden of Eden setting. They try to establish a civilized society with what they know, what they came from, and they fail miserably. Golding has, among the 24 boys, he has 4 main characters, and they are archetypal characters. That is to say, the boys, each one of these main characters, besides being a real blood and flesh boy, is also a symbol or a pattern of types of people in a society. Okay. So the two older boys that are the potential leaders are Ralph, who is a good-natured, good-hearted, well-intentioned natural leader on one hand, and then you have Jack, who is the leader of the choir boys, and he's resents Ralph's leadership, and he's more of a power-hungry, no rules kind of guy. He also becomes the leader of the hunters that kill the pigs. That there's wild pigs on the island. They have meat on the island. They have seafood. They have fruit. They have everything they need to live. They have places for shelter. So they have the material setting to make it work. Ralph and Jack are the 2 main conflict people. A third major character is a little fat boy that's called Piggy. He is asthmatic. He's the butt of jokes. He is rather annoying person, but he's also intelligent and mature. He sets up governing rules for the group. He finds this big conch shell, and he devises the idea that instead of everybody yelling at once, who's ever holding the conch shell talks, and then the group listens and discusses, and they hand the shell one to the other. So you have this kind of mini democratic setup that he advises. The other thing he says here's his intelligence. We've got to keep the signal fire up on the top of the mountain going so we can be rescued. Well, the fourth character is a somewhat younger boy named Simon, who's about 10 years old. He is a sweet-natured and very precocious, insightful boy. And Golding, in later interviews, said, Simon is my hero in the book. This is my hero person. He is a Christ figure.
How about that?
Golding says this.
How about that?
He calls him the Christ figure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, to kind of really telescope the plot, all of the cooperation breaks down. The hunters become a group unto themselves. They disrupt the meeting. They won't follow the rules. They break off into their own band and go have their own shelter on a cave on the side of a cliff. They start painting their faces. They all have spears. They throw off their clothes, and sad to say, most of the boys in the group go to follow them. It's another example that the mob on a regular basis chooses Barabbas.
Yeah.
And
that's a very insightful observation right there.
So they have these hunting rituals. Their job was supposed to keep the signal fire going. They neglect that job. The signal fire goes out. Now, along with that, there's this, at this point in the novel, they're all afraid of something they call the beast. They see something moving on the top of the mountain, and they imagine it is something evil, something beastly. They call it the beast, and they're terrified of it. Well, one day the hunters are out killing a pig. They're way up on the mountain. They won't go to the top because they're afraid, but they kill this pig. They cut his head off, put it on a stake as an offering to the beast. In other words, it's a metaphor for a pagan sacrifice to placate the beast. And this bloody head has all these flies flying around it. And this is the point in the book where you first hear the phrase, Lord of the Flies.
Now, this is kind of interesting to me because I was leading a Bible study and we were going through, I think it was First Kings. And as we were going through First Kings, I found that there was a Canaanite god that was referred to as Beelzebub. And in the column, it says, Lord of the Flies. And William Golding got a little advertising out of that whole deal right there. But that is the reason why I went back and read this book. I thought, well, what's the connection here? And here's the connection. There's the pagan god that was on top of the mountain there, the Lord of the Flies. And I suppose he was in a cave, wasn't it?
Well, he was high up on the mountain. He was not in a cave, but he was visible on this stake right below where the top of the mountain was, where the boys were afraid to go.
And it was a pagan type symbol, idol of sorts.
A totem, yes.
And so it was that Beelzebub had his own idol there for the Canaanites as well.
Their own Baal,
Yeah,
it's the
exactly.
Old Testament would have it. And I do believe that Golding absolutely had that
in mind,
biblical item in mind.
Because that, as part of the whole plot, it's a relatively small piece of the storyline, and yet that became the title of the book. Well,
it does, and the one of the key scene, maybe the key scene in the book is where Simon is not afraid of. Simon is a very brave boy. He even says to the kids in one of their meetings, he says, "I don't think there's a beast. I think it's only us," which is very perceptive. And so he decides, I'm going to go up there and find out what that beast is. He goes up to the top of the mountain. He finds out that the so-called beast was the dead pilot who had bailed out of the plane, and it was his parachute that was blowing around. So Simon cuts the parachute loose. The wind blows the body out to sea, and he starts coming down the mountain, and he comes to the pig's head, and he looks at the pig's head, and he starts having a vision that the pig's head is talking to him, or it's not clear. Golding writes this ambiguously. It could be a vision. It could be a demonic oppression. It could be just a deep insight of Simon's. But Simon hears this voice talking to him, and the voice coming from the pig head says to Simon, I'm going to read my little high school softcover here.
All right.
You are a silly little boy, said the Lord of the Flies. What are you doing up here all alone? Aren't you afraid of me? Simon looks at him and says, you're a pig's head on a stick. And then the voice starts getting very scary. He says, fancy thinking the beast was something you could hunt and kill. You knew, didn't you? I'm part of you. Close, close, close. I'm the reason why it's no go, why things are the way they are. And he further down, he says, you know perfectly well, you'll only meet me down there. So don't try to escape. So Simon by now is afraid, and this whole monologue is a very scary monologue. And Simon faints. So while, yeah.
Well, I just want to, now he's up in the mountain. Incidentally, as you're reading that, and I'm thinking to myself, you know, that's really where people went to meet God, was on the mountain. And so Simon went up to find his God, if you will, and he ended up seeing that. I don't know if that means anything, if you make anything out of that, or do you think that this is a turning point in the book when Simon has that vision?
Oh, yes, yes. So those are great questions. I do think that it was deliberate that there was a mountain here, and that Simon went up and he found truth at the top. You know, he found out the beast isn't something outside us.
Yeah.
It's inside us. So he starts back down. He wants to tell the boys the good news. And so this is a climax of the book, this great insight into what the truth is. So it could be regarded as a turning point. It's certainly the spiritual climax of the book.
You know, maybe this is relevant, maybe it's not, but, you know, Friedrich Nietzsche was, as at least Golding was at one point, and that is, he was quite the atheist, and he was rather direct at times. But one of the things that he says is that there is no transcendent truth, that all we have in this world, and when we talk about truth there being an ultimate truth, and then the artist, philosopher, theologian, pastor helps interpret that truth for people to understand. Well, Nietzsche said there is no transcendent, no ultimate truth. All there is interpretations. And so I'm thinking here that that Simon has been to the top of the mountain, and he has come face to face with the truth, and the other people are left to the interpretations.
I think that's exactly right. Not only that, to carry the image even further. Well, let's see what's going on down at on the beach. While Simon is going through this, they're having a feast on the beach, and they're dancing around a fire. They're cooking a pig. They're dancing around with their war paint on and their spears, and it's a very savage kind of pagan kind of thing. And Simon is coming down to tell them this good news. Here again is this Christ figure thing. He wants to help them. He was the helper. He used to help the little kids, and now he wants to come down and say, look, there's no beast up there. The evil is us, and you know, it's the way we're behaving, and it doesn't have to be this way. So by the time he gets down to the beach, it's dark, and they're dancing around this fire. And he comes out of the bushes, and the boys all turn, and they're frightened. And one of the boys yells, "It's the beast." And they all run over with their spears, and they stab him and kill him. So the
Wow.
Christ figure is impaled.
Wow. So here's the one who comes down off the mountain with the transcendent truth, with the ultimate truth. All these people have no absolute truth, no transcendent truth. They have only interpretations. Their interpretations are wrong, and so when this Christ figure comes down, they crucify, if you will, that figure who came with only truth.
Yeah, I do think that is imagery that Golding definitely is implying here. Well, the next day after this disaster, the two remaining good guys, Piggy and Ralph, go over to the cave on the side of this cliff where the tribe is hanging out. And they try to talk to them. They try to say, look, we've got to get together. And Piggy steps up because he is the articulate one. He says, we've got to keep the signal fire going. We've got to work together. He holds up the conch shell. He said, we've got to follow the rules. This is no good the way this is. What would the adults think of us and all of this? Well, they're not having any of it. And one of the gang pries a boulder loose off the top. It comes down and hits Piggy, knocks him off the cliff, and kills him.
Mm.
At that point, Ralph realizes it's all over. And Ralph starts running, and they start chasing him. They're going through the forest chasing him. They start a fire to flush him out. The forest, the island is burning. It's a conflagration. And in the end of the book, Ralph is coming out of the forest, crawling all smoke stained and crying, and he's on the beach, and he looks up, and he sees a naval officer standing there. So,
now, let me ask you something. Now, these people, they're caterpillars in a ring of fire, if you will, and there's only one way off for Ralph, and that's if he has to be actually rescued. And so now we have this naval officer who's there to rescue him. Is that naval officer a savior?
Well, I'm happy to give you a definite answer on that, John. It's yes and no.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that clarity.
Okay. So yes, Ralph's life for the moment is saved. The boys will be removed to the warship. But let me just read a couple of sentences on the very last page. The naval officer sees these boys and he's appalled. And he looks at them and he finds out that two of them are dead. They don't even know how many are left. And he says to them, I should have thought that a pack of British boys would have been able to put up a better show than this. Mm-hmm. And Ralph says, well, it was like that at first. And the officer says helpfully, oh, I know, jolly good show, like the Coral Island. Well, Ralph looks at the island, the scorched island. Simon is dead. And the tears start to begin to flow, and sobs shook him. Shuddering spasms, burning wreckage of the island. All the boys begin crying and shaking. Ralph wipes his nose and he says, this is the quote, Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of the wise true friend called Piggy. The officer, surrounded by these noises, was moved and a little embarrassed. He turned away to give them time to pull themselves together and waited, allowing his eyes to rest on the trim cruiser in the distance. It's where Golding ends the book. They're going to get on a warship. So not much of a rescue. You go from this warfare that existed on the island that they turned an Eden into a hell. It's like Satan's quote in Paradise Lost. The mind is its own place and can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. And that's what the human being does in Golding's view. So the conclusion here is, what kind of rescue do we have here? The adults are on the brink of this apparent atomic war blowing up the world. So Golding ends the book there, and he gives no hope of escape, of resolution, and he's a spiritual pessimist in that regard. So, I mean, what did you take out of that ending?
Well, you saw a little bit more than I did, but I come to the same conclusion that here's this naval officer, the adults playing like adults, playing with nuclear weapons, and the children are playing with children weapons, spears, bows and arrows, and but they're both going to the same place, which is ultimate destruction. And I guess this is a way in which Golding is saying that sin is pervasive, if you will. Depravity is pervasive. It goes everywhere. It affects everyone. Even the innocence of youth is affected by depravity. So that there is no innocence, really.
I think that Golding had a number of things that he was trying to get across. And he actually said in an interview in 1964 that his book shows that defects of society are directly traceable to the defects of the individual. And in other places, he talked about human nature being defective, including that of well-bred children, as inherently evil. But he was also deeper than that. He was a very perceptive guy. He did not believe in the Rousseauistic alternative of the noble savage, that people are good and are corrupted by things on the outside, by social institutions, or the Marxist notion that people are corrupt because they don't have an equal share of the goods. He was surprisingly Calvinist in his view of human nature. So I think that the Christian reader has a lot to ponder in reading this book, but what do we have to look forward to, and is there hope?
Yeah, well, you asked that question, and all of this actually makes me think of a quote from Mark Twain. Mark Twain wrote this. He said, "I've been reading the morning newspaper. I do it every morning, knowing well that I shall find in it the usual depravities and baseness and hypocrisies and cruelties that make up civilization, and causes me to put in the rest of the day pleading for the damnation of the human race. I cannot seem to get my prayers answered, yet I do not despair." Somewhere, Mark Twain found hope. I'm not sure he found it in either the people or in a Christian God. I don't know where Twain found himself, but all I know is that as we move further down this path of looking into some of the writings of some of folks along the way, there are some that found hope in a living God and a relationship with that living God. We're not done with this theme of sin and depravity. We're going to take a look at a book by Fyodor. Did I pronounce that right? Fyodor Dostoevsky. And he's going to provide us with a little different perspective, although he would agree with Golding, Mike, on his observation about humanity. Nevertheless, he's going to come to a different conclusion about hope and where it's found. And so Dostoevsky wrote this. He said, "Although your mind works, your heart is darkened with depravity. And without a pure heart, there can be no complete and true consciousness." And Dostoevsky decided that there was a way to find a pure heart. It wasn't from within, but it was, as we talked about it, from a rescue from above. And so we'll be talking about it in our next time together.
That'll be the brothers Karamazov, and
I call them the Brothers K.
The Brothers K.
That avoids all the rest of that.
And we're going to have a different answer by a different author to this dilemma of evil in the heart of men, and the kind of hope that Dostoevsky shows that exists in his belief in God, and how his characters work through that. Much more complex book than Lord of the Flies, but an interesting counterpart to Lord of the Flies.
Well, we'll be looking forward to delving into that our next time.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you,
Appreciate your
John.
help.
My pleasure.